They were few in number, often no more than a handful of men, dropped into the darkest corners of occupied Europe. Yet their presence struck fear deeper into the German war machine than entire battalions. To the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Gestapo, there was one whispered truth that frontline diaries, intercepted messages, and post-war testimonies confirmed. The Germans feared fighting British Commandos more than any other Allied unit. And not because the Commandos were superhuman, or because they had better weapons, but because they changed the very nature of war, replacing predictable battlefield lines with shadows, uncertainty, and surgical violence delivered in the dead of night. This is the story of why these men terrified the most powerful army in Europe. When the war began in 1939, Britain was nearly alone, wounded by the retreat from Dunkirk, threatened by invasion, and desperate for a way to strike back. But Winston Churchill understood something his generals did not. Britain didn't need to overpower Germany. It just needed to unnerve it. So in June 1940, he ordered the creation of specially trained troops of the Hunter class, who can develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. These would become the Commandos, men who volunteered knowing their missions would almost certainly be deadly. Men who trained not to hold ground, but to infiltrate, sabotage, and vanish. To the Germans, this was not war as they understood it. They were masters of blitzkrieg, tanks, divisions, momentum. But commandos moved like ghosts, slipping from the sea, using terrain as a weapon, and attacking with a precision that made no sense on a map, but every sense in psychological warfare. It wasn't about how many they killed. It was about how unpredictable they were. German commanders could prepare for a frontal assault. They could fortify a town, mine a beach, and defend a river crossing. But how do you defend against men who could appear anywhere, anytime without warning? The fear truly began with the raid on the Lofoten Islands in Norway in March 1941. Only a few hundred British commandos landed, but in 6 hours they destroyed factories, sank ships, captured codes, and vanished with barely a casualty. German troops arrived to dead silence. No bodies, no ammunition, no papers left behind. It was like the attackers had evaporated. Invulnerability is a myth in war, yet the commandos came dangerously close to embodying it. Reports flowed into German headquarters, describing attackers who moved with impossible speed, firing from angles that shouldn't exist, and disappearing into terrain like it were an ally. Soldiers wrote in letters home that they feared being stationed along coastlines more than fighting on the Eastern Front, and the fear grew. Hitler himself intervened in 1942, enraged by the embarrassment and disruption caused by commando raids. He issued one of his most brutal orders of the war, the Kommandobefehl, the Commando Order. It stated that any commando captured, whether in uniform, unarmed, or attempting to surrender, should be executed immediately. No trial, no POW rights, no mercy. Even German officers questioned the extremity of this command. If an army is ordered to kill an enemy on sight, without hesitation, then that enemy is something the leadership fears profoundly. And Hitler feared British commandos because they represented what he despised most: small, agile, unpredictable resistance against his vision of absolute control. But brutality only strengthened the commandos' resolve. They adapted, trained harder, became more ruthless in their precision. Their training, in fact, was another source of German fear. Commando candidates endured a regimen beyond anything the average soldier could imagine. Mountain climbs without gear, night navigation across freezing moors, hand-to-hand combat with real blades, live fire exercises designed not to simulate death, but to flirt with it. They learned to kill silently, move without sound, memorize enemy routines, sabotage rail lines in seconds, and endure pain long after most men would collapse. German interrogators noted something chilling when capturing a commando. These men did not break. They resisted interrogation, misled their captors, or died with secrets intact. Even the SS, infamous for coercion, admitted British commandos had a dangerous calmness. Then came the raid that cemented their mythic status. Saint Nazaire, March 1942. A force of barely 600 commandos attacked one of the most heavily defended ports in France. Home to the only dry dock large enough to service the German battleship Tirpitz. The commandos didn't sneak this time. They struck head-on, using a ship packed with explosives to ram the dock gates, then fighting through the city against thousands of German troops. The destruction was catastrophic. Saint Nazaire was rendered inoperable for the rest of the war. But what terrified the Germans wasn't just the success. It was the savagery of the fighting. Commandos fought street to street, firing until barrels glowed, refusing to surrender even when surrounded. One German soldier wrote, "They attacked as if already dead. Rarely did a small group of men inflict so much damage on such a critical target." For months afterward, German coastal units believed another commando raid was imminent, whether it was or not. Then came the Bruneval raid, where commandos dropped by parachute stole parts of a German radar system under the noses of its defenders and escaped by sea. Then Vagso, another brutal clash in Norway that left German morale battered. Then operations in Greece, Italy, and the desert, each raid feeding the legend. Every German coastal unit, from France to Norway, lived with a creeping anxiety. No matter how fortified they were, commandos could still come. They didn't respect front lines. They didn't follow the clockwork of conventional war. They were hunters. Psychological fear is often more potent than physical danger. Diaries recovered after the war show German soldiers requesting reassignment specifically to avoid commando-threatened regions. Some wrote that nighttime guard duty became unbearable. Shadows felt like enemies. The silence felt like a warning, and every splash of water could be the start of a raid. The commandos didn't have to attack constantly. A possibility of an attack did the work for them. German commanders adopted new defensive strategies specifically because of commandos. Coastal units doubled their patrols. Searchlights were left on all night. Alarms were tested constantly. Entire battalions were tied down, guarding tiny inlets and rocky shores instead of reinforcing battlefronts where numbers mattered. In a way, the commandos achieved something extraordinary. They forced Hitler to defend everywhere, weakening his ability to attack anywhere. But the fear wasn't just tactical, it was deeply personal. The commandos embodied a kind of fighting spirit the Germans did not expect from the British. German propaganda had painted Britain as weak, declining, unprepared. But here were men who proved otherwise. Men who stood among the most elite in Europe. The commandos weren't simply soldiers. They were symbols. Symbols that Britain was not broken. Symbols that resistance could strike, even under occupation. Symbols that, even in darkness, the enemy could bleed. During the Italian campaign, German mountain troops faced British commandos who climbed cliffs at night under full enemy observation. A suicidal move by normal standards. But the commandos reached the summit undetected, overwhelmed the defenders, and opened the path for an entire division. German survivors wrote that the attack had no logic except madness or mastery. And mastery it was. Then came Normandy. On D-Day, British commandos landed not as raiders, but as shock troops, leading assaults on beaches, strongpoints, and villages. Their green berets became symbols of relentless advance. German officers specifically warned their troops not to underestimate men with the Commando dagger badge. They were considered priority threats. After the war, one German general admitted, "Where the Commandos landed, our resistance cracked earliest. Their aggression was unnatural." Why unnatural? Because Commandos were taught not just to win, but to refuse defeat. They kept fighting when surrounded. They continued advancing under machine gun fire. They completed objectives after losing half their number. To Germans accustomed to orderly, disciplined warfare, the Commandos' refusal to break made them unpredictable, and unpredictability is terrifying. By 1944, the Commandos had reshaped Allied special operations everywhere. The U.S. Rangers, the SAS, the Chindits in Burma, all were inspired by their success, and the Germans knew it. Facing any special unit carried echoes of those early commando raids that had unbalanced entire regions. Even when the Commandos didn't participate in an operation, German soldiers often assumed they had. Fear needs only a rumor. But perhaps the deepest reason Germans feared British commandos is this. Commandos represented war fought on human terms, man to man, face to face, in the dark, without the comfort of overwhelming firepower. Blitzkrieg allowed soldiers to follow machines. Commandos forced soldiers to rely on courage. Most soldiers, on either side, were ordinary men, but commandos were built differently. Fighting them meant facing opponents who chose the hardest path, who volunteered for the most fatal missions, who trained to embrace pain and uncertainty, and who believed that terror could be turned back on the enemy. In the final months of the war, when Germany's defeat became inevitable, SS officers gave briefings describing enemy threats in order of danger. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft were listed. But for small unit engagements, British commandos topped the list. Not because they were the deadliest, many units inflicted greater casualties, but because they broke the German sense of control. They struck with precision, disappeared like illusions, and fought with a dedication the Germans respected even as they feared it. And after the war, when German veterans gathered and told stories, the same pattern emerged. They spoke bitterly of Russian tanks, of American air power, of starvation and retreat. But when they spoke of the commandos, their tone changed. There was a pause. A quiet acknowledgement of something different, something personal, something they never forgot. Because the commandos were not just soldiers. They were the embodiment of Britain's refusal to surrender. A symbol that courage, multiplied by discipline, could terrify even the strongest army in Europe. And in the shadows of coastal cliffs and silent forests, in raids that lasted minutes but echoed for months, they proved that the greatest power in war is not numbers, nor weapons, nor territory. It is unpredictability, willpower, and the ability to make the enemy fear the dark. This is why Germans feared fighting British commandos more than any other Allied unit, not because they were invincible, but because they fought like men who had already pushed past the limits of fear and made it their most devastating weapon.